Okay, perfect. Well, thank you everybody for coming. We have a really fun uh, kind of workshop today. We're going to talk all about React hooks. And so if you are familiar with React, but you've worked with class-based components and you haven't really gotten into hooks yet, then this will be a great introduction to that. I think we have a really fun project for how to walk through all of that. And additionally, you're going to see a few ways to work with hooks. One on how to work with some of the most popular hooks like useState and useEffect, but I'm also going to show you how you can actually create your own hook, which is going to be pretty cool and something that I think you're going to be able to reuse quite a bit. So in fact, the code by the end of this that you're going to have access to is something that you can literally copy and paste directly into your own applications. So what I thought would be a really helpful way of learning hooks is how to build in responsive behavior directly into a React application. So right here, we have this application and it has this cool looking chart. And this chart is from VX, just a code library, very popular code library for building out visualizations. And so this works great on a nice big screen, a desktop screen. But what if I wanted to be able to make this fully responsive? So like if I were to just click and drag this window to kind of mimic what it would look like on mobile, that doesn't look very good. And what if I wanted to add some really unique behavior? Like if you look at some of the controls that are built in, you have this polar control that's a different layout. What if I wanted the ability to actually, if I switch to mobile, have this be what's shown and have it all happen dynamically? Well, that is something that we can utilize hooks for, and we can take a full set of listeners and responsive behavior and implement that directly into the application. So that's what we're going to learn how to do today. So I think it's going to be a really nice, fun way of doing it. I have the code here. So I'll share a link to this code inside of the chat. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so here, let me send it out to everybody. Okay, in the chat, you will have access to that. So that is the link to this GitHub repo here. Now, if you are relatively new to React hooks, then what my recommendation would be to not actually follow along yet. There's going to be a recording uploaded to YouTube after this. And then my recommendation would be to just kind of follow along and watch everything that's happening, and then to come back and then clone this repo, and then you'll be able to go through it. But you're going to have some understanding, because if you try to do this as I'm typing it all out, then if you get stuck, then you're going to miss some things that I'm going to be explaining, and then it's going to be harder to learn the concepts. If you're already experienced with React, then you can definitely follow along. To follow along, all you're going to have to do is clone this repo, which you can do with the GitHub CLI, with SSH, with HTTPS, or you could download the zip, and then that's going to bring down the entire code repository for you. It is completely configured to already work. All you have to do is install the dependencies. So to do that, you would make sure you're at the root of the project and type npm install, and that's going to go and it's going to install all of the dependencies. If all of them have installed properly, then you can run npm run start, and then that is going to give you the live server running, and you're going to be able to see exactly what we have right there in the browser. So that is how you can get up and started with the code. Now I will get rid of that and we will get started. So before we go into building all of this cool responsive behavior, I wanted to take this workshop truly as a true introduction to working with hooks. And so in order to do that, I don't want to jump right into this type of more advanced feature. And so instead, I want to walk through exactly what hooks are and how you can use them. There's all kinds of different ones. If you just Google React hooks, you'll see that there are quite a few of them. And then you'll also see some other examples on how you can make your own. One of the most basic hooks to work with is called useState. useState gives you the ability to save local state inside of a component, and you can think of it as a variable and also a way of setting a variable. So let's say, for example, I'm going to hide our cool little horizontal tree component right here. And on the right-hand side, I'm going to open this up so that we can see the code and what is happening all at one time, just to make it a little bit faster. So I'll hit save. Everything here is going to just go away, and we're left with an empty slate. So that's good. So right here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a counter. So for a counter, I'm going to use a useState hook, and the syntax for that is where you say const, and then inside of square brackets, you type the name of the piece of state. So in this case, I'm just going to call it counter, and then the setter is going to be called set counter, and then that is going to use useState. And I'm using TypeScript. If you're just using vanilla JavaScript, then you will want to, up here at the top, your imports would look something like this. You'd import React and then useState, and then that will be from React. That's what you would do if you're doing vanilla JavaScript. I'm using TypeScript, so it's going to look a little different, but the core functionality is exactly the same. So here I can say react.useState, and then inside of useState here, I'm going to start our counter at 0. So now let's just come here, and inside of what's getting returned, I'm going to put brackets, because that's how JSX allows us to write JavaScript code and have it rendered out. And I'm going to wrap a h1 tag around this counter just to make it really easy to see. So now you can see that that counter is right there, and it's set to 0. So how can we change this? Well, because the set counter function, it gives us the ability to actually change the value, to change the state of that data. So what I can do is I can create a button. So I'm going to create a button tag here, and let's call this one add. And then with the button tag, I am going to have a listener. So I'm going to say on click, I want a certain function to run. So on this one, I'm going to say I want that set counter function to run, and I want it to equal the current counter value plus 1. And so if I hit save now and come here, now if I click on add, notice that it's adding just like a normal counter would. And so all that's happening here is you can think of a counter as the ability to access the value for a piece of state. And then the second item inside of the brackets, this is the function that allows you to set that value. So we can call this function, and this is a function just like any other JavaScript function. So this would be, the same as creating a function called set counter and then, running the function just like that. And so this gives us the ability to set that value. And then inside of here, I'm just taking whatever the count value is, and then I'm adding 1 to it, which is exactly what you'd want if you were wanting to add to a counter. Now, if I want to subtract, then I could create another button here, and then I could say set the counter equal to the counter value minus 1, and then I'll just call this subtract. hit save here. And now we have these two buttons. If I click add a bunch of times or subtract, I'm getting that count behavior. So that is, if you've never worked with hooks before, that's your very first hook. That gives you the ability to access data and then also to set data, to be able to make changes to those values. So what we're doing here, this is a very basic example, but this is what we're going to use to springboard into building out our more extensive hook, our hook that's going to give us the ability to actually go and listen for changes with the window to see how wide it is or how narrow it is, and then to make changes based on that value. So I'm going to, if you go to the master version on GitHub, which you can access that, so I'll show you how you can access that. So if you go to that repo I shared, and instead of being on the starter, just go to where it says master, and then from there, you'll be able to see all of this code, the final version, and I also added some other examples as well. So hopefully you'll find that beneficial, specifically for useState. So that is all there. I spent some more time doing that so that you could have a few more examples in case this is still a little bit fuzzy. So now that we have that in place, now let's move on to another hook. So we saw the syntax for useState. Now we're going to see another one. This one is called useEffect. So useEffect gives us the ability to set up triggers. So one of the easiest triggers that you could think of is when a page loads up, and in this case, when a component loads up, what if you want to have some process run? That's a very common thing that you're going to want to do. So imagine that you're setting up some kind of invoicing application and you click on the more details link to get all the details for that invoice. You want the ability to go out, get all of those details from a server, and then show them, render them on the page. Well, the useEffect hook can listen for when that new page loads up, and then you can run a set of processes inside of that. Don't worry if that's still a little bit fuzzy. We're going to walk through a number of examples specifically on that. So I'm first going to set up a few more pieces of state. So first one I'm going to set up is going to be called window width, and then set window width. And then we're going to call react.useState. And then for this one, we're going to start this one out at 0. And then you're going to see how it's going to be pretty much instantly set up for us. So window width, and then I'm also going to do one called screen type. We're not going to do anything with this quite yet, but we're going to set it up so that we can at some point. So we're going to set screen type and then set screen type. And for this one, we're going to have a few different screen types that are going to be strings. For this first one, I'm just going to call the first one initial. And then later on, you're going to see how we can actually leverage our listeners that we build out, and we can have access to a string value that says if we're on a tablet, on a desktop, or on a smartphone, and how we can set those values and then we can retrieve them from any place in the application, which is really cool and incredibly helpful. I can't tell you how many times I've needed to implement that type of behavior into applications I've built out. So that's the first part. Now let's work with the useEffect hook. So what I'm wanting to do is anytime that the window size changes, and when I'm talking about the window, I am referring to this entire browser window. So what I want to do is whenever the screen size changes, especially when it changes width, I want to capture that value. I want to know what that is, because that's going to determine everything that I want to show. Remember back in the very beginning, I said what I wanted to do with this. I want the ability to dynamically change the size of that graph. And then on certain screens, such as mobile, I actually want to change the value inside of one of the components. I want to switch to a different layout entirely when I'm on mobile. So in order to do that, I'm going to use the React useEffect hook. So I'm going to say React dot useEffect. And then the syntax for useEffect is to start with a set of parentheses, follow it with a set of empty parentheses, and then a fat arrow function followed by curly brackets. So this right here from 9 to 11, that is the basic syntax for the useEffect hook in React. Now I'm going to talk about something that we add on to it, but I'm not going to worry about that quite yet. I'm going to show you, but we're going to just kind of keep it in mind. I'm going to show you something we need to add right after the curly brackets. So inside of this useEffect hook, what's going to happen is anytime the component loads up or anything changes, this is going to be triggered. And we can test this out. I can just type in a console log here, and I could say in useEffect, just like this. And then I can open up the terminal and notice here, see how it's in useEffect. So that what we just typed out, that got logged to the terminal because we put it right in this useEffect hook. So everything there is working. So now what I want to do is we've learned about useState, we learned about useEffect. Now what I want to do is show you how we can actually tie in to some of the native types of APIs inherent with JavaScript and specifically with browsers. So the next thing I'm going to show you has nothing to actually do with React. We're going beyond that and we're tying into the actual browser, and we're going to see how we can access different data points from that. So if you've ever done this, and I think I've taught this a few times in a few of the videos I've done, but if you open up your or if you open up the browser dev tools, then, and it's giving me, Zoom is not playing nicely at the moment with that. Let's see, there we go. Okay, there we go. And so if you wanted to access what's called the window object, you can open up the browser tools. I'll zoom in here so it's a little easier to see. And I can type the word window. This is something specifically built into the browser. So if I type the window and hit return, window is actually an object. So window is something that has functions. It's just a normal JavaScript object, as functions, as data points, as all kinds of different things. So right here, if you open up window, you can see all of these functions. And if you're ever curious when you're looking at this JavaScript type code, if it has this little cursive or italic F right next to the word, that means that that is a function. If it doesn't, then it means it's a like a string or some other data point. You can tell the difference here where it says default status, it says that's equal to a string. And whereas with, say, something like alert, that has a function and it shows you how to call it. So this is the window object. This is what we need because this has all kinds of relevant data for us. Specifically, this tells us how wide the window is, which tells us thousands of things, but that's the one thing we really want to know. So what we can do is I can type in window dot inner width. You could see you have the height as well, but inner width, and you can see that it has an actual value of 500. Now, if I switch to the browser, and let's widen this up again, and now if I type window.inner width, now you see where it's 1131. That's pretty cool, right? That gives us the ability to know how far how wide the window is, which means that we can use this data. We can listen for the window and when it changes, and then we can change our application. We can do everything that we need to do. We can resize images, we can load an entirely different layout, anything like that you can do because we have access to this window and this inner width. So that is what we're going to build out here in this useEffect hook. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to use what is called a listener. Now this is another thing specific to window. So I'm going to say window dot add event listener. So this is one of those functions. If you went through that full list of functions when we typed out window, add event listener was one of those. And then I'm going to listen for an event. So here, the event I'm going to listen for is the resize event. So what this is going to do is anytime that the window changes in terms of size, that is the listener that we're going to add. So what an event listener does, if you've never worked with them before, it's perfectly fine. What we're saying is we want to listen for an event and then we want to do something. So the thing that we want to do is we need to pass in a function. So let's see what we could do here. Well, I could console log something out. So I can say console log, and then I could say something like resized. But look, that's throwing an error. And why is that? It's because this is what's called a callback function. So callback function, once again, don't worry if you've never heard of it before. What this means is that we can't pass in a function like console log that has to be run right away. Instead, what we have to do is pass a reference to a function, and then the listener is going to it's going to go in and it's going to run that function for us. So I can cut that and I can create a new function. So here I can create a function, and let's call this one something like update window width, or something like that. It's going to be a fat arrow function. It's not going to take in any arguments. And then I'll paste in that console log statement. And now here in the window dot add event listener, now let's paste in that update window width function. And now you can see we're not getting that error. It's because we're not actually calling the function. We're just telling JavaScript, we're saying, hey, when you listen for that resize event, I have this really cool function that's going to do all this kind of stuff. I want you to call it. So we're not doing it. If we were calling it, we would have to add the parentheses right afterwards. Notice that gets an error. And so instead, we're passing a reference to that function. So let's hit save and let's just see if this is working. So let's hit refresh. And let's also open the console back up. There we go. Oh, and look at that. It says resized. So let's do this again. So let's do it. And notice every time I move that, it's getting changed. That's exactly what we want. Now let's take this one step further. Let's come in here and let's say we want it to say, okay, this is resized to, and then you can pass console log multiple arguments. We can say window dot inner width. So notice how this is following the exact type of process that I would personally be following if I was building out a feature like this myself, where I just take little tiny chunks of functionality and build on each of those. And so right now, notice how we've now created a callback function. We are checking to see these values, and now we're going to see if we have access to window.inner width. So let's hit save, and let's open up the console again. And so now when this gets changed, look at that. Now we have access to see every time that we are changing the window, and it tells us that exact size. That's pretty cool. Okay, so we're actually getting shockingly close to where we want to be. So now that we have that, now inside of update window width, let's get rid of this console log statement. And instead, what I want to do is I want to update the state. So now we're connecting our vanilla JavaScript with our React. And so I'm going to say set window width, and I'm going to set this to window dot inner width. There we go. Just like that. And to test this out, instead of console logging it, I'm going to go into the layout here. And once again, I'll create a h2 tag. And inside of here, we'll call the state. So window width. And don't get this confused with window inner width. Window width is the name of our hook, of our piece of state. So this is set to 0 because that is the default. When we call useState, the very first piece of data that we pass in, that is the very first thing. And then from there, as I'm resizing, then that is getting adjusted. So this is all working beautifully. This is exactly what we're wanting to do. So what are the next steps? Well, there are a few things that we want to do, and that is with useEffect. Notice how when I start this, it starts at 0. That's not exactly what we're wanting. So now it's time to talk about the next thing that I was mentioning, where we can pass in a second argument to useEffect. And what this gives us the ability to do is we can tell React what data to listen to. So I can tell it to listen for window dot inner width. And now inside of these brackets, what React is going to do is it's going to listen for any changes in this value. And anytime something changes with the window inner width, it is then going to call all of the code inside of this useEffect hook. So let's hit save and let's do this again. And oh, wait a second. I actually would crash the entire system. And this is one of the, let me see, make sure I didn't yet. Okay, yeah. So what's happening here is something very important. Anytime that you are using a useEffect hook and then you're changing a piece of state with that, inside of that, then you could actually be causing a recursive loop. So anytime that you're using a useEffect hook, what you want to do is actually pass in, it's called a cleanup function. So the way to do that is you pass in something to actually return. So I'm going to say return a function, and I'm going to call the function just cleanup, just like this. And then inside of here, we are going to remove this add event listener. So the way we can do that is I can say window dot remove event listener, and then we're going to pass in resize and then the update window width, just like this. Hit save, hit refresh, do all of that kind of stuff. And now all of this is working, and now we're actually maintaining our memory a lot better. So this is all working nicely. Now we're still getting this 0. Don't worry about that. We're going to take care of that in not too long. And there's a few different ways of doing that. One would be inside of useState, I simply could say in here, just put in whatever window dot inner width is. And when it gets started at the right value. So that's all working beautifully. So far, so good. Now, we've completely ignored the screen type, though. So what can we do here? Well, this is the reason why I wanted to put this in here. This is actually almost copy and paste out of a few projects that I built out because I reuse this type of functionality so much. And having this inner width is nice, but I don't want to remember how many pixels wide the tablet is and when I want to start with mobile and all of those kinds of things. So what I do is I have my window width value, which helps. That tells me how many pixels wide the screen is set to. But I also like to just create a string value for that. And so here, what I can do, let's call screen type. Let's add another H2 here. And let's call screen type. And now inside of update window width, let's change this name because we're going to do more than update the window width. Let's call it update window dimensions. This is just a better practice. Make sure that your functions and your variables do exactly what they say they're doing. And so inside of here, I can add more functionality. So in update window dimensions, I can add a conditional. So here I can say if the window dot inner width is greater than, and these are some values I personally use, but you can use whatever ones fit your own project. And here I can say if the window inner width is greater than 1300, then I want to set the screen type to be desktop. Then I'm going to add a else if condition. So I'm going to say else if the window dot inner width is less than or equal to 1300 and the window dot inner width is greater than, let's say, 800, then I want to set the screen type to tablet. Lastly, we're just going to have an else condition. So if it's greater than 1300, it's on a desktop computer. If it's between 800 and 1300, it's on a tablet. If it's anything else, it's going to be on mobile. So here we're going to say set screen type, and this will just be on mobile or smartphone or anything that you want to call that. So let's hit save and see if this is working. So by default, we get our initial and then we get 500. That's working. Now let's start moving things. There we go. So notice we're on mobile, we are on tablet, we are on desktop. Look at that. That is pretty cool. That gives us all kinds of kind of just ways of working with devices. Now, let's move on to seeing how we can work with the rest of our application. So it's really nice that we can have access to those values. And so now in this horizontal tree, what I can do is I can do something like I can put this equal to the window width value, and then the height, we can keep it 400 for now. Hit save, and now we're going to have our chart back. And this still isn't exactly what we're looking for. So this is giving us our window width, and it's adjusting, but it's not really kind of where we're at quite yet. We need to do some calculations here. So we can say window width and then minus, I forget what value I had this set to, maybe like 200, something like that. And that's going to be a little bit closer. And so that's going to be what's going to make up for the difference on these margins and padding and that kind of thing. But this still isn't really ideal. And remember, we also have the issue where I want to have, when we switch to mobile, I want it to actually switch the layout. Well, that's going to be tricky because that means we're going to have to go this horizontal tree. And the way that that is set up is this Cartesian value, that's the default layout. We want to be able to actually change that in this other component. Well, so what do? We could just copy and paste all of this code. So lines 6 through 27, we could copy this, we could put it in the horizontal tree component, and then that would give us access to it. That's really a bad way of writing code, because then all of a sudden you're going to have to copy all of those lines of code into every single file that needs this behavior, even though this is going to be the identical behavior for each one of them. So what we can do is we can create our own hook. So you've seen useState, you've seen useEffect. What we can do is we can create our own internal hook that the rest of the application can use. That will be pretty cool. So that is going to be that next step. So let's do that. I'm going to open up the file system here. And inside of the components directory, but you can put this really anywhere, I'm going to create one called hooks. And then let's call this something like use responsive. You could call it use dimensions. You could call it use anything you want. And this is just going to be, if you're using TypeScript, a TS file. And now what we're going to be able to do is mimic pretty much everything that we just set up. And then we're going to simply be able to call this from anywhere in the application. So let's see how we can set this up. So I'm first going to say import star as React from React. And then this is going to be an export. We need to call this from other files. So I'm going to say export default. This is going to be a fat arrow function that's not going to take in any parameters. So that's a way that you'd write a export default, just like that. And now what we're going to be able to do is cut all of this code. So let's cut all of this and let's put it inside of this function. And notice we don't have any errors or anything like that. So now all of this behavior has all been placed inside of this use response hook. Now we have to return something though, because if we call this right now, it's going to run those processes, but no data is going to be returned. So what I thought would be kind of cool, and this is exactly what I've done in several projects, is I actually return an object. So here I'm going to return an object of the window width and then the screen type. Now this is shorthand for saying whenever you're working with JavaScript objects, if you name the object the same as the value, the same as the key, then you can use this syntax. This is literally identical to writing code out, writing your object out like this. So if you happen to create an object and you're writing it where the value is named exactly the same as your key, then you don't have to actually be explicit about writing the object out like that. You can just return it just like this, and that's the exact same thing. So that is our use response hook. Now we can use it. So let's get rid of let's comment out our horizontal tree really quick, and then let's import this new use response hook. So I'm going to say import use responsive from, and then this was ./hooks/use responsive. And now inside of here, let's just see the values that we have access to. So I'm going to say const, and then this will be just val. I'm going to split this up in a second, and then use responsive. And then let's just console log this value out. So this is going to be val. Okay, hit refresh, check this out, and there you go. You see our val has the window width and the screen type. So far, so good. That's looking really nice. Now that means because we have access to this object, that means we can perform destructuring. So I can get rid of val, and I can say const window width and screen type, just like this. And now everything should work exactly the same as before. Look at that. That's pretty cool. We have been able to consolidate all of that code, and we've been able to simply use our own hook that gives us access to these values. And really quick, just because I want this to look really nice, I want to go in, let me look up my media queries. So in the media queries for determining how wide these cards are, I have that set up so the width takes up 80%. So what this means is that if we are on tablet or we're on anything like that, we want to be at 80% of the value. So what I can do is we can actually set up a conditional here. And so I'm going to say const, and let's call this function chart sizes. And this is just going to be a fat arrow function that doesn't take any arguments in. And I can say if the screen type, make sure that I pull that back in. Yeah, so if screen type is equal to desktop, then I want to return an object here. So I'm going to return a width of 1200 and then a height of 500. And then I'll say else if the screen type is tablet, then I want to return something that's a little different. We're still going to return a height and a width, but now what I want to do is I want to take that window width value and I want to multiply it by 80% because that mimics exactly what we're doing in the media query. And then I want to move the height to 400. And then lastly, if it's mobile, so else if screen type is mobile, and technically we could just say else because we know if it's not any of those other things, then it's got to be mobile. But just for the sake of setting each one of them up, we'll say if screen type is mobile, then let's return something slightly different. So we're still going to keep that window width at 80, but now let's move the height to 300. So we're going to shrink that. And then last but not least, else, then let's return 0 and 0, just so we always have a default. Okay, so now that we have all of that, now what we can do is we can call this function chart sizes. So we can say chart sizes, call the function, and then call for the width value that gets returned. And then same thing here, chart sizes, call the function with parens, and then ask for the height value. Hit save, and then come here. And oh, let's see, what's it not doing? What did it not like? Oh, you know what it is? It's because it's not setting, it's looking for that initial value. So that's the issue. But look at this, when you resize it, notice that, there we go. Look, the height is changing. That's beautiful. So the height changes along with the width. So we now have all three versions there, which that is really neat. So to fix the whole mobile one or the initial, what we'd need to do is right here, instead of having like an initial value, then we would need to have like the first value set. So we just have to set up, and we're almost out of time. So, and I want to show you how to affect the other one, but all you'd have to do is change this initial value and then be able to place in, some default, something like that. And then that's all you're going to have to do. So you can do that on your own, or also I think I did that in the final version if you want to go access that as well. Okay, so let's finish off the last thing. So now, because we have this cool hook, so we have this window, we have access to window width, we have access to screen type, and we can do it with a single line of code. Now we can change this value. So that is going to be pretty cool. Let's see how we can do that. We can open up the horizontal tree here. And at the very top, let's import this hook. So I'm going to say import use responsive from, and then this is going to be ./hooks and then use responsive. And then the syntax for calling it's going to be the exact same. So inside of horizontal tree, we're going to say const, and then for here, we just need the screen type. So here we just need the screen type, and then that is going to be calling use responsive. Make sure you call the function itself. And then we're also going to use a useEffect hook. So here, we're going to want to listen for those changes. So here you can call react.useEffect. And this is good practice. You get to do another one of these. And here we're going to be listening for changes in the screen type. So that's that second argument. And here what we'll say is if the screen type is set to mobile, then we want to update this layout. So we want to say, if that, then we want to set the layout to polar. And if not, which means if it's going to be on tablet or if it's going to be on desktop, then we want to use Cartesian. Hit save. And oh, looks like I have a little typo. Oh, yeah. So make sure that you're adding those in. And let's see, I have one other typo that you probably see somewhere. Let's see. Oh, there we go. So on the import, there we go. Okay, now if I start changing this, look at that. When we're on mobile, it is automatically on polar. Now, start changing it again. The second that you get to tablet, it's switched to Cartesian. When we switch to desktop, it stays with the same layout, but it adjusts the size. And then keep going, keep going. When we're down to mobile, it is switched to polar. So that is pretty awesome. You have, with one responsive function, essentially, with this functional component, you have built out a pretty powerful tool. You've built out the ability to actually change and make different parts of your application completely dynamic based on the screen size. And so when you're ever on an application, a web application, like say Twitter or Facebook or something like that, if you start changing the view, you'll notice that it doesn't just change a few things on the page, it actually reorganizes the entire layout, and it's accomplished by things like this. So media queries, like we have right here, these are very helpful for basic elements. So those are very helpful for, establishing certain high-level sizes and that kind of thing. However, a media query cannot do something as powerful as changing a default value with a component. And there are many times, so take, for example, what we have in the app here. This is a library. This is not something I built out. This horizontal tree is something that is in the VX library. And there are many times where you don't actually have the ability to reach in and add a media query to a certain class name. So there are plenty of times where you're going to run into situations that you need to actually create dynamic listeners and know the value of the window size. And that's something that is so common that it is incredibly helpful to have your own responsive element here. And so not only do you have that now, but you also hopefully have learned a lot more about React hooks, how to use them, some of the different versions of them, some of the best practices with how to work with them. And now you can go out and you can start adding those into your own React applications.